Chapter 10: A Democracy of Clothing. At the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, the government had to provide hundreds of thousands of uniforms for men in the army. This was the first time in American history that so much clothing had to be required all at once. During the American Revolution, the colonial army had been relatively small, and most soldiers brought along their own clothes. In the later wars, too, like the War of 1812 and the Mexican War, the armies were only a few thousand strong. So in 1861, there was no large ready-made clothing industry. The simple explanation was that it had always been the custom for each family to make its own clothes. Just as the meals that American families were usually made at home, so it was with coats, suits, socks, and nearly everything else a person wore. Only the rich few who could afford to look elegant would hire a skilled tailor. In New England, in the early 1800s, just a few shops sold ready-made clothing, but these offered only the cheapest grades. In New Bedford, Massachusetts, for example, sailors who had just returned from a 3-year-long whaling voyage needed new clothing quickly. Other sailors who had just signed on for a new voyage had to collect supplies hastily for their months at sea. People called the stores that sold sailors these clothes slop shops. That's because the clothing they sold was sailors' slops. Slop was an old Norse word for the sailors' wide-bottomed trousers. What sailors bought there, they put on board ship in their slop chests. Slop clothing was of poor quality, and the customer did not expect a good fit. In the South, too, some plantation owners bought cheap ready-made clothing for their slaves. In western mining towns, the men who had quickly joined the gold rush had usually left their families behind. There were too few women to provide homemade clothing, and not enough rich people to support a tailor. And so miners had to go to stores for their clothes. Store-bought clothing wasn't good, but it was better than nothing. People took it for granted that if you bought ready-made clothing from a store, it could not possibly fit you well. They believed that everybody was a quite different size. Therefore, they said the only way to make clothing fit was to have it made specially, either at home or by a tailor, to your very own measurements. How could a manufacturer possibly turn out thousands of suits, each a different size, for thousands of different people? A suit you bought in a store would surely be too loose in some places and too tight in others. Manufacturers, without even trying, had given up the effort to provide sizes that would really fit. Take shoes, for example. Before the mid-1800s, even after shoemaking machinery had been invented, the shoes you could buy ready-made in a store were usually straights. That meant there were actually no difference between the shoes sold for the right foot and for the left foot. If you really wanted your shoes to fit, you had to hire a shoemaker to make a pair especially for you. The uniform makers in the Civil War learned a lesson. They found that if they made quite a few different sizes, they could provide almost everybody with a reasonably good fit. They noticed that certain combinations of measurements were more common than others. For example, lots of men with a 36-inch waist also had a 30-inch trouser length. They kept track of the sizes of the uniforms they made. When the war was over in 1865 and hundreds of thousands of veterans suddenly needed civilian clothes, the United States actually had a clothing industry. Manufacturers had learned so much about the commonest measurements of the human body that they could produce ready-made suits that fitted better than most homemade suits, and almost as well as the best tailor-made. Merchants now began to open clothing stores for everybody because their assortments of sizes would fit any customer. Americans of all classes and occupations were glad to buy their clothes ready-made. The age of statistics, a new age of careful measurement, had arrived in the world of clothing. A statistically minded tailor named Daniel Edward Ryan spent years collecting facts, and in 1880 he published a book called Human Proportions in Growth, being the complete measurement of the human body for every age and size during the years of juvenile growth. The new science of sizes gave clothing manufacturers a scientific guide for customers of all ages. To put this new science to use, and to stock clothing stores with all the different sizes, there had to be a whole factory full of new machinery. The old tedious way of making garments Cutting clothes for one suit at a time and then sewing each seam by hand was not good enough. Most of the labor went into sewing, so the most important new machine would be a sewing machine. In 1831, a Paris tailor named Bartholomew Thimonor had made a workable sewing machine. He had begun to use it to make uniforms for the French army, but Paris tailors, afraid that they would lose their jobs, smashed the machines and drove the inventor out of the city. Soon afterward, several Americans began to make sewing machines. Walter Hunt was one of the most ingenious inventors of the age. Once, when he needed money to pay a debt, within the space of only 3 hours, he invented a safety pin. He made a model of it and sold the idea for $400. But he was more interested in making inventions than in making money. Among his new devices were a knife sharpener, a stove to burn hard coal, an ice plow, a repeating rifle, a street sweeping machine, and paper collars. The vast new department stores and the catalogs of the new mail-order firms offered ways to show and sell such gadgets to Americans wherever they lived. Most inventors who tried making a sewing machine had not got very far, because they tried to make their machines imitate hand sewing. So they put the point of the needle at one end and the eye or hole of the needle at the other. Hunt was more original. He put the hole at the pointed end of the needle and ran the thread through the hole. Then he attached the other end of the needle to a machine that simply pushed it up and down. The machine then thrust a completely separate thread through the loop underneath the cloth. Using this original idea, by 1832, he had perfected a machine that sewed a lock stitch that would not unravel. But Hunt was not at all a businessman, and he did not even bother to patent his invention. Elias Howe had been raised on a Massachusetts farm when he worked as an apprentice to a scientific instrument maker. A few years after Hunt made his sewing machine, Howe made the same invention on his own. He patented his machine in 1846. To prove that his machine worked, Howe staged a public sewing race at the Quincy Hall Clothing Manufactory in Boston. He challenged 5 of the speediest seamstresses. 10 seams of equal length were prepared. Each seamstress received 1 seam, and Howe and his machine received 5. To everybody's amazement, before any of the seamstresses had finished even 1 seam, Howe had finished his 5. His sewing machine was declared the winner. But people feared that the new sewing machine would put needy seamstresses out of work. As late as 1849, the sewing machine was still so rare that a man carried one around western New York State charging an admission fee of 12.5 cents to see a great curiosity. The Yankee sewing machine. Ladies took home specimens of the machine sewing to show their friends. Not for long would machine sewing remain a curiosity. A remarkable go-getting salesman and organizer had become interested. When Isaac Merritt Singer saw his first sewing machine in 1850, his main aim, like that of Henry Ford after him, was to make machines so cheap that he could sell them by the hundreds of thousands. When he used Howe's patented design without permission, the courts eventually made him pay for the right to use Howe's design. But in 1856, Singer persuaded Howe to join a great sewing machine combination to make machines with all the latest improvements. Singer's dream came true. By 1871, more than 500,000 sewing machines were being manufactured each year. The combination of Howe design and the Singer salesmanship sent American sewing machines all over the world. Every nook and corner of Europe, the advertisements boasted, knows the song of this tireless singer. The women who still had the job of making all the family's clothes were, of course, happy to have a machine to ease their work. And the sewing machine was only one of the first of many new machines: washing machines for clothes and dishes, vacuum cleaners, mixing machines for the kitchen, and many others. These would make the life of the 20th century American family both easier and more complicated. Sewing seams took the most time when a manufacturer wanted to make a man's coat or suit. The next most costly step in the manufacturing process had to do with cutting the cloth for the pattern. To cut heavy cloth for one suit at a time was tedious, but it was hard to make a knife that would cut through thick piles of cloth. The knife tended to twist the cloth so that the bottom pieces came out a different shape. This problem was solved in the 1870s when the new high-speed steam-powered cutting machines sliced neatly through 20 or more thickness. In the 1880s, a Boston inventor perfected a machine that saved more hours by automatically cutting and finishing buttonholes. Each factory-produced suit had to be neatly pressed, but the old heavy pressing iron, called a goose because it was so large and had a long, awkward handle, was slow. A clever apprentice, Adon J. Hoffman, was using a goose in a tailor shop in Syracuse, New York. He dislocated his shoulder and could not handle the cumbersome iron. So he invented a presser he could operate with his feet. A foot pedal controlled the steam pressure that pushed down the top pad. All the operator had to do with his hands was to lay the garment between the pads. Within a few years, Hoffman had become rich by selling thousands of these new steam pressers. As the population grew and the American worker prospered, the demand for good, ready-made clothing went up. At the same time, too, near the end of the 1800s, the flood of immigrants from Germany, Russia, and Poland included many who had been tailors over there. They naturally went to work in clothing factories in the United States, but the new sewing machine was making the tailor's skill less needed than ever. In the new clothing factories, the wives and children of these immigrants found quick employment. Some of these factories became sweatshops, where women and children worked long hours in stuffy rooms for low wages. But soon, new laws required the children to stay in school. Meanwhile, labor unions led by enterprising immigrants organized the clothing workers to demand better wages and shorter hours. Eventually, the unions themselves would become rich enough to provide hospitals, clubhouses, and scholarships for their members. By the end of the 1800s, the United States saw a revolution in clothing. For the first time in history, a democracy of clothing was beginning to appear. You did not have to be rich to dress well. A new industry was finding ways to make a stylish suit that any man could afford. Before 1900, 9 out of every 10 men and boys in the United States were wearing ready-made clothing that they had bought in a store. Even the rich, who had once hired a tailor, found ready-made suits to fit. Americans dressed more like one another than people in any old world nation. The new immigrant could go into a clothing store and buy a ready-made outfit that made him an instant American.